Hello and welcome to this revision podcast on Labour and the Economy 1997 to 2007. Let's start by looking at Gordon Brown, the main man. He's given a free hand in the Treasury Department as a result of the Grenada Agreement. Or so we believe. He started out with a really good reputation for running the economy and building up financial reserves and keeping inflation down. He was initially cautious. His priorities were to keep inflation low, keep spending under control, and to prove to Middle England that Labour was pro-business, and this was reassuring to industrialists. He got away from the image of Labour as a tax and spend party. Now, he is taking the credit, or has taken the credit, for the global phenomenon of deflationary pressure, which allowed low interest rates and it made people feel richer, although he's not getting much credit anymore. This period of cautiousness lasted for 3 years when he started spending highly again. He blew £3 billion by selling that amount of gold to China at low prices, which would nowadays be worth 19 billion roughly. This has been named the Brown Bottom, as he sold the gold at rock bottom prices. He introduced 66 stealth taxes, including a tax on pension dividends and national insurance, reducing TESA's, PEPs and ISA tax-free schemes as well. One of the first things he did as Chancellor was to give the Bank of England independence in setting monetary policy and interest rates, or which included interest rates rather. He also changed the inflation measure from retail price index to consumer price index. And finally, he gave responsibility for banking to the Financial Services Authority from the Bank of England. And all these things were done within days of Labour's election victory. On taxation and public spending, well, public spending was 40% higher, roughly, in 2008 than 2000. And over his chancellorship, he reduced the basic rate of income tax from 23% to 20%. Corporation tax also fell. In 1999, he introduced a 10% tax band, but abolished it in 2007 in his last budget to raise tax levels for over 5 million people. Tax overall has increased from 39 to 42% in his time. The biggest turning point was in 2000, and the spending review then called for a raise in taxes, for example national insurance and other indirect tax, to pay for public spending in health and education. In 2002, after the sale of mobile phone licences, however, he sold them for £22 billion. Brown used that windfall to pay off debt rather than use it on public spending, which meant his reputation soared. By 2002, Britain's interest payments as a proportion of its income were the lowest since 1914, which is also good. He introduced working tax credits in 2003, which is a payment from the state to people who work on a low income. But on the other hand, there's a criticism of using PFIs to fund new projects through the private sector instead of spending it direct from the public purse, which meant that it could just be, and probably will just be, storing debts for the future, as these businesses, the private businesses, are still claiming and will still be claiming rent, inverted commas, from the government for years to come. On employment, they introduced a minimum wage. They increased unemployment by 2.5 million between 1997 and 2007, and there were record numbers of people in employment. However, unskilled and young workers were still unemployed, and lots of the jobs were created in the public sector, which made Britain a client state and undermined democracy. It's unsound as they undermined incentives, so Lynch says, and these could also be seen as non-jobs, paying ourselves the money we haven't earned. It also makes it hard for the private sector, who are actually making money, to recruit, as the public sector have taken all the workers. Let's have a look at borrowing now. The growth in the economy was unsustainable because it was driven by debt finance consumption. An increase in public spending led to more borrowing, as it could not all come from taxes, because New Labour had promised not to tax. £100 billion is borrowed from foreign bankers. This didn't hit the headlines in the time of prosperity, but when the credit crunch happened, it became clear what Brown had done. Personal borrowing to buy consumer goods also went up, with deregulation of credit cards, etc. And the government had been blamed for letting it go on too long. It's been called a recipe for recession. With pensions, Brown had taxed the dividend payments which companies paid to their investors. This led to the value of pensions falling drastically, Marr says by £100 billion. Pensions were then seen by the public and companies as a worthless investment, or at least not a worthwhile one. In Europe, the rebate, well, obviously France had argued that Thatcher's rebate went against the obligations of the treaties that we'd signed, and Blair argued that he would not give up the rebate, partly because we'd never really got all of it. Britain had also received less from the cap than any other major nation, and Blair argued that we could not give back the rebate unless there was a change in the cap. But we didn't get either the cap reform, and Blair also buckled on the rebate in 2006, which is where you get the began as a tiger and ended up a doormat quote from. And we had to give £7 billion more in contribution to Europe than we had before New Labour. When Brown came to be Chancellor, he set 5 economic tests for Britain to join the euro, and in 2003 the Treasury announced that they hadn't been met. In government intervention and privatisation, obviously Blair and New Labour had abolished Clause 4, and they did actually privatise air traffic control, although they promised not to before the election, and they did that in 1998. You could also argue that PFI is a form of privatisation. On the other hand, when Northern Rock got into trouble in 2007, they were bailed out by the government and the Bank of England. So overall, through the New Labour years, with low inflation and steady growth, most of the country grew richer. The growth since 1997, at 2.8% a year, was above the post-war average, and Britain's GDP per head was above both France and Germany's. We had the second lowest jobless figures in the EU. But as the credit crunch has shown, this was financed by high public borrowing and a massive public sector. Let's have a look at historical interpretation. Ruth Lee, director of the Centre for Policy Studies, said, "When the Chancellor inherited the economy from the Conservatives, he was a very lucky Chancellor indeed, and his fiscal policy was initially very sound." But she concludes, under his stewardship, economic and productivity growth have slowed, the balance of payment figures have worsened, private sector employment growth has fallen, and the fiscal situation has deteriorated, and international competitiveness has fallen. And that was in 2005, 3 years before the credit crunch. In 2001, Daniel Ben-Ami argued that the economy was only healthy in the way that a middle-aged man was healthy. Although unlikely to get into trouble, there is little chance of anything exciting happening. Rowe says that Labour had inherited very, very favourable economic circumstances. He also says that living standards remained high and the consumer economy boomed, but was based on credit card spending and personal debt. Andrew Marr says New Labour was about a more secure economy, radically better public services, and a new deal for people at the bottom. Marr says the independence of the Bank of England removed at stroke the old suspicion that Labour would favour high employment over low inflation. And finally, Marr says the pension fund hit, though more complicated than just blame Brown, caused more anger directed personally against Brown than any other single act in his time as Chancellor.